Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. We live in an increasingly interconnected world, right? And the boundaries of business have expanded way beyond our cozy domestic markets. So today we are taking a zoom-out journey into the multi-layered, incredibly complex arena of the international business environment. If we really want to understand how top-tier firms make strategic decisions, how they allocate resources, and how they survive massive global shifts, we have to map out all the forces pushing and pulling them from every single side.
So here is our map for today. First, the core, beyond domestic borders. Second, the first ring, navigating the microenvironment. Third, the outer rings, decoding the macroenvironment. And finally, the global web, risks, rewards, and ripples.
All right, part one, beyond domestic borders, the core.
Now you might be wondering, why does a company that absolutely thrives in its home country suddenly stumble and struggle the moment it tries to expand internationally? It's a fascinating puzzle, isn't it? I mean, you've got the exact same product, the same killer branding, the same brilliant executives, but the outcomes are just completely different. Well, the answer lies in the sheer complexity of leaving your comfortable, familiar home market.
Think about it. Domestic business operates within a relatively uniform legal framework, local cultural norms that you just get intuitively, and steady socioeconomic dynamics. It's a safe haven. But international business? Oh man, that is a totally different beast. You are suddenly navigating this minefield of fluctuating currency rates, completely diverse legal systems, language barriers, and contrasting consumer preferences. It's no longer about playing by one set of rules, it's about adapting to the policies and expectations of dozens of nations all at once.
And the zoom-out model brilliantly illustrates exactly how this works. Picture the international business environment as a set of concentric layers surrounding a firm. Right there at the core, you have your controllable internal decisions, things like production, finance, HR, and marketing. Surrounding that is the domestic environment, but as you push outward, you hit the foreign environment, and finally, the vast global environment. As a business moves outward through these rings, it goes from dealing with internal stuff it can easily control to massive external forces that are just completely out of its hands.
Which brings us to part two, navigating the microenvironment.
So the microenvironment is basically your immediate neighborhood. It consists of four key players: suppliers, customers, competitors, and market intermediaries. If you are operating internationally, you are constantly interacting with this complex web of trade peers, distributors, and industry networks. These are the players that directly and immediately influence a firm's day-to-day decisions and operations in a foreign market.
Now, our source material highlights a really interesting point here. The microenvironment can be handled and manipulated through high-quality strategy. That is huge because unlike the sweeping global forces we'll talk about in a minute, firms can actively monitor and influence this specific layer. By reaching out to customers, outsmarting competitors, and building super tight bonds with intermediaries and suppliers, a business can actually shape its immediate surroundings and excel in international markets.
Let's move to part three and see how this builds, decoding the macro environment.
Now we're zooming out further to the macro environment hexagon, often called the PESTLE framework. We've got political, economic, sociocultural, technological, legal, and environmental forces. These are the broader, uncontrollable sweeping forces that ultimately dictate the success or failure of a venture. They shape where resources are allocated, who you partner with, and how fast a market can grow. A firm's ability to flourish overseas relies heavily on their cultural awareness, their political forecasting, and their legal preparedness to navigate these six giant forces.
So the crucial point here is how profoundly these macro factors, specifically the economic ones, impact daily operations. Let's dig into these drivers. When GDP grows in places like China or the US, consumer purchasing power rises, which creates massive new demand for imports. Conversely, if you operate in Argentina or Turkey, inflation can rapidly spike your costs, forcing constant price adjustments. And think about central banks. When the US Federal Reserve raises interest rates, it actually increases the value of the dollar. Suddenly, American exports become more expensive and imports get cheaper. Literally, one policy change in one country can completely alter a multinational firm's global strategy.
To really ground this, let's look at how the biggest brands handle these macro shifts. Apple constantly tweaks its market approaches based on GDP fluctuations to perfectly time when they can capture middle-class consumption. Toyota is an absolute master of navigating business cycles. They trim output and delay projects during economic slowdowns, but then they invest heavily in factories the second growth returns. And luxury brands like Gucci? They rely on deep socioeconomic data to literally shift their physical store locations, moving to Asian cities where they see a wealthy, burgeoning middle class. They don't just sit back and react, they adapt to the macro environment to survive.
All right, moving into our final section, risks, rewards, and ripples. We have reached the absolute outermost layer of those concentric circles we looked at earlier. We're talking about transcendent global financial systems and monumental international institutions, like the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. These forces transcend national boundaries entirely. You cannot just negotiate with them locally. Instead, these bodies monitor global indicators and release the critical economic data that multi-billion-dollar corporations rely on to plan their operations for the next decade.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how the global web creates a massive domino effect. Because the environment is so tightly woven together, a disruption in one area instantly sends shockwaves everywhere else. Back in 2008, what started as bank failures in the United States spread like wildfire to Europe and Asia simply because of interdependent stock markets. More recently, during the coronavirus pandemic, delays in Chinese manufacturing lines immediately halted production for car makers in Europe and electronics producers in America. You simply can't ignore global conditions because eventually they will show up at your front door.
Which brings us to a final, pretty provocative thought. If a single event on the other side of the globe can disrupt the entire supply chain and dictate the success of the world's largest companies, how might tomorrow's inevitable economic or political shift impact the businesses that you interact with and rely on every single day? The international business environment isn't just something that happens out there. It is a constant, shifting force that touches all of us. Thank you so much for exploring this explainer with me. Keep asking great questions, and I'll see you next time.